A Respectful Life Described by Ezekiel Hopkins. Let us consider the duties of the wife towards the husband. They are these which follow. First, submission and obedience. This is required from them as absolutely and peremptorily as unto Christ himself. Wives, submit yourself unto your own husbands as unto the Lord. And again, therefore as the church is subject unto Christ, so let the wives be to their own husbands in everything. And not only doth the apostle give authority and command for it, but enforceth it by sundry reasons, as, number 1, woman was made out of man, and therefore ought to be subject unto him. The head of the woman is the man, for the man is not of the woman, but the woman of the man. She is bone of his bone, and flesh of his flesh, and therefore ought to pay him the homage of obedience and submission for those materials of her being, which she first received of him. 2. Because the woman was made for the man, and therefore ought to be submitted to him. So in the next verse, neither was the man created for the woman, but the woman for the man. She owes her being to the man's necessities and convenience, and the great end of her creation, next to the glory of God, was that she might be helpful and profitable to him. It is not good that the man should be alone. I will make him and help meet for him. Therefore, having received her being for the sake of man, she ought to be subject unto him. 3. Another reason which the apostle gives is taken from the priority of the man's creation. I suffer not a woman to usurp authority over the man, for Adam was first formed, then Eve. Therefore, in the same rank of creatures, it is but fit that he should be first in dignity, who was first in nature. And 4, because by the occasion of the woman, sin entered the world. So 1 Timothy chapter 2, verse 14. Adam was not deceived, but the woman, being deceived, was in the transgression. Therefore it is but fit and just that she, who made all mankind disobedient against God, should herself be made subject and obedient unto man. In this sentence we find inflicted upon her as a punishment for her transgression. Thy desire shall be to thy husband, and he shall rule over thee. Not as though there would have been no submission due from her to man if sin had not entered the world by her means, for the reasons before alleged do manifestly prove the contrary. But now her submission is a curse, and whereas before it would have been easy and pleasing unto her, now it is become burdensome and grievous. Man being made more unpredictable and bad-tempered by sin, and harder to be pleased, and she being made less able and willing to do it, God justly and righteously punished her by imposing on her a work that she herself hath made irksome and difficult. And let me add to these reasons of the apostle. Number 5. That the man's titles do imply superiority and authority over the wife, such as Lord. Sarah obeyed Abraham, calling him Lord. He is likewise called the head and guide of his wife. 6. The husband represents Christ, the wife, the church, and that in this very particular of superiority and submission. Therefore, as the church submits to Christ, so let the wife be to her own husband. Thus we see wives' submission abundantly proved, both by natural and spiritual arguments, and this submission is recommended unto them by the example of holy women to whose practice they ought to conform their own. Holy women also, who trusted in God, adorned themselves, being in subjection unto their own husbands. And Paul gives it in charge to Titus to exhort wives that they be discreet, chaste, keepers at home, good, obedient to their own husbands. And he exhorts them to the same duty. Wives, submit yourselves unto your own husbands, as it is fit in the Lord. These commands are so many and so expressed that there is scarce any other duty that the Scripture doth urge with so many examples and earnestness, with such pressing reasons and enforcing motives as this of the wives' obedience. The duty is frequently expressed, submit yourselves, and the manner of performing it, be subject as to the Lord, submit in the Lord. This phrase carries it in three things: a motive, a direction, and a limitation. 1. A motive to obedience. It is done to the Lord. And though, through the froward and peevish humors of the husband, they may have no other encouragement to observe and obey him, yet to the conscientious wife this will be encouragement enough. The Lord will accept and reward her obedience. Her heavenly husband, Jesus Christ, will count it as a service done unto him. For marriage being a type of our mystical union with Christ, Paul especially is concerned that the duties of that relation be performed to bear some proportion to that spiritual mystery. 2. A direction how to perform it. It must be as to the Lord. She must obey her husband, not only with a design of pleasing him, but the Lord Christ. For were it not that God commands it from them as part of their duty and obedience to him, it might sometimes seem very fit that bad-tempered and self-willed men should be crossed, and that those who have no other reason but their will should fail of that observance and groveling that they tyrannically expect. But then consider, it is not the husband only that commands, but the Lord, and the wife must eye his sovereign authority through the authority of her husband. Then it will appear that though there be no necessity in what is required by her bad-tempered husband, yet there is a necessity she should perform what is required to honor Christ. 3. The words import likewise a limitation of her obedience. The wife must submit and obey, but in the Lord and as to the Lord, that is, only in lawful things, wherein by her obedience to her husband she may not offend against God. And accepting this in all other cases, the wife is absolutely bound to obey the will and commands of her husband to the utmost of her power. It is true, he abuseth his authority if he commands things unnecessary and unfit, yet neither her unwillingness to perform them, nor her judging them inconvenient, can excuse her or exempt her from the obligation that lies upon her of a ready obedience. Nothing can do this but the unlawfulness or impossibility of what is enjoined. In all other things, although they be never so contrary to her disposition and inclination, she is bound by the law of God and nature to obey and to submit, if not her judgment, at least her practice to the will of her husband. She must do so whether she thinks it fit or unfit to be done, so long as it is not unlawful. Unless she can meekly persuade her husband to revoke his command, she is obliged to perform it. Otherwise, when the apostle commands wives to submit themselves to their husbands in everything, it would signify no more than in everything that they think fit. This certainly is no greater submission than every husband would readily yield to his wife, and it falls infinitely short of the apostle's intent. He requires this subjection of the wife to the husband in everything. As the church is subject unto Christ, this certainly is not in everything she thinks fit. Neither ought she to take upon her to judge or reject his laws, but to fulfill them. This, therefore, is the first and most comprehensive duty of a wife, submission and obedience. 2. Another duty of the wife toward her husband is respect and reverence of his person. Let the wife see that she reverence her husband. Now reverence consists in two things, esteem and fear. First, she ought to cherish a high esteem of him, if not for his gifts and graces, yet at least for that relation in which he stands to her, as her Lord and her head, superior to her by God's appointment and ordinance. Yea, she must look upon him as that person whom God, out of all the numerous millions of mankind, hath particularly chosen and selected for her, one whom he saw fittest and best to be her head and guide. Second, another part of reverence is fear, not a servile, slavish fear, for that is inconsistent with love, but an awful and a loving fear, which will show itself in two things. 1. In her care to please him. She endeavors to conform her actions to his inclinations, so far forth as they are not repugnant to the supreme duty that she owes to God. She that is married careth for the things of the world, how she may please her husband. Therefore she will endeavor how to comport herself in her speeches, in her gestures, in her whole demeanor, to render her most grateful and most amiable to him. 2. In her joy in pleasing him, and grief in offending him. Indeed, a good wife should be like a mirror. A mirror, you know, hath no image of its own, but receives its stamp and image from the face that looks into it. So should a good wife endeavor to frame her outward deportment and her inward affections according to her husband, to rejoice when he rejoiceth, to be sad when he mourns, and to grieve when he is offended. This is that respect that wives owe to their husbands, thinking highly and honorably of them for their place's sake, and endeavoring to avoid and shun whatever may offend them. Therefore, those who are cross and vexatious, and by clamorous and contentious speeches, or by thwarting and peevish actions, grieve and sadden the hearts of their husbands, let them know that they highly provoke the Lord, who hath commanded reverence and respect to be paid to the husband as his type, and as part of the reverence and respect that is due unto himself. 3. Another duty of a wife is helpfulness to her husband. She ought indeed to be a help to him in everything, to his soul, in furthering his graces, and wisely and opportunely admonishing him in his duty, at least by a holy and blameless conversation. By this she commends the gospel of Christ unto her husband, that at length he may begin to esteem and reverence that godliness which hath so adorned and qualified his wife. For what knowest thou, O wife, whether thou shalt save thy husband? As the apostle speaks, to his body by cherishing and tendering of it, to his good name by endeavoring to augment and preserve it, reporting well of him, and silencing and convincing any scandalous rumors that may be spread abroad concerning him, to his estate, wherein indeed lies her chief helpfulness, and which she ought to make her constant and daily employment. If she cannot bring in and get anything to increase the stock, yet she ought prudently and frugally to manage what her husband entrusts her with. She ought not to waste it vainly and profusely, for let her know that whatsoever is so spent or wasted is but stolen. If she shall alienate anything from her husband, contrary to his consent, either expressly declared, or else upon good grounds supposed to be tacitly granted and allowed, it is not better than theft. Her proper office is providently and faithfully to manage the affairs of the family that are committed to her oversight and care. Therefore, in the description of a good wife, given us at large, in Proverbs 31, from verse 10 to the end, we find the whole of it taken up, in showing her industry and care in ordering the affairs of the family. 4. Another duty of the wife is modesty in apparel and behavior. First, in apparel. This should be according to her place and rank, not affecting gaudiness or strange fashions, nor, on the contrary, affecting a singularity of obsoleteness and outworn antiquity. Pride may be equally shown in either way. The best temper is for them not to wear garments to be taken notice of. The Apostle gives them this rule. Let not the woman's adorning be that outward adorning of plaiting the hair and of wearing of gold, or of putting on of apparel, but let it be the hidden man of the heart, and that which is not corruptible, even the ornament of a meek and quiet spirit, which is in the sight of God of great price. And so Paul, I will that women adorn themselves in modest apparel, with shamefacedness and sobriety, not with broided hair, or gold or pearls, or costly array, but which becometh women professing godliness, with good works. This indeed is the best ornament. It makes them lovely in the sight of God, and it makes them esteemed by all sober and serious persons. Indeed, I do not think that costly array is in either of these places absolutely forbidden, but the prohibition is to be interpreted either by the degree. Be not excessive or vain in your apparel. Study not so much how to set off yourselves in your garment, as how to adorn yourselves with a meek and quiet spirit, with sobriety, modesty, and good works, which is the richest and most beautiful robe you can wear. Second, as she must be modest in her apparel, so in her behavior and deportment. Her countenance, gestures, and speeches must be all fitted to show the inward calmness and serenity of her mind. Therefore, imperious, clamorous, and turbulent women, who at every word spit passion and poison, are a torment and vexation to themselves and more to their husbands. The contentions of a wife, saith Solomon, are a continual dropping. And it is such a dropping that it will at last eat and fret through his very heart, though it were made of stone. These, therefore, are the duties of the wife. For daily readings and devotions, please subscribe to Puritan Readings.